For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to Stratnewsglobal and welcome to The Gist, our signature show on foreign affairs and security. Welcome back. I am Surya Gangadharan, and today we are going to talk about India and NATO. And I have with me a guest from Singapore, Dr. C. Raja Mohan. He's a well-known strategic commentator and thinker, and he heads the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. Welcome, Raja. Long time.
Thank you, Surya.
So briefly, let me give a sense as to why I picked up NATO. As you're aware, there is a summit that was held only the other day. And I recall an article by a former US Assistant Secretary for Europe and Eurasia, Wes Mitchell. Now, he wrote this article in the Hindustan Times saying that NATO should make an outreach to India. And this article was written sometime in March this year. And he had indicated that perhaps it could be raised at this current summit that was held only the other day. So that is really the trigger for this. And then we also had a response from Raja Mohan the very next month. So that's what we're going to talk about right now. Raja, when we look at India and NATO, are you aware of any outreach to India?
Look, nothing. You see, the problem has not been on NATO's side. The problem has been there has been a general reluctance on India's part, at least until now, to engage in a formal dialogue with NATO. Nobody is asking us to join the institution. No one is asking you to have some kind of a formal military cooperation. Because after the Cold War, I probably recall, NATO was set up during the Cold War. It was a very powerful military institution. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, they had actually opened dialogue with Russia, the post-Soviet Russia, with China. A lot of countries in Asia have informal consultations with them on, limited exchanges, learning from each other and that kind of stuff. But India, for some reason, has been hesitant to engage in that kind of a process. So I think that level of simple, mere consultations. For example, NATO has been in Afghanistan for the last 20 years. So can India talk to them and say, look, what's your experiences? What's our experience? We know this, we know that. So that is a straightforward, simple consultative mechanism. For example, Singapore, where I am, takes some advantage of NATO, NATO's training missions, NATO's outreach activities. But we have kept completely away from it. So a very straightforward, simple consultative approach is open for India. And I think if India takes a political decision, that should be fairly possible. But I think what Mitchell was talking about was a much larger set of cooperation. Just as the G7 talked about, getting the democracies together. Because G7 used to reach out to all countries. China used to be there, all kinds of countries used to go. But this time they're branding it as a G7 plus other democracies in the non-Western world. What Mitchell is talking about, I think, if I get him correctly, is that as NATO must look to the East, to begin to engage in a serious strategic consultations. Now, this idea we saw come up in the NATO summit a couple of days ago, where for the first time the NATO has agreed to look at China, to look at Asia as a potential arena where they should be concerned. Meanwhile, China is also reaching out to, is expanding its influence in Europe. So I think we are at the beginning of a debate that NATO would also look to create partners in Asia. And I think Japan, Australia, India, all these will be their very natural partners. So I think there is a new moment, which if you're interested, if Delhi is interested, it can take advantage of that. Just as we took advantage of the G7 process, we could also begin to engage NATO on an informal basis. One final thought. One consideration perhaps in Delhi was, look, what would Russia think? But my argument was the Russians themselves were talking to NATO. The Chinese were talking to NATO. Why is it that India will not talk to NATO? So I think it's easy consultation. The simple consultations are easy, but the strategic consultations, there is a new moment. There is a new context in which NATO is going to look to the Indo-Pacific and the East So I think it is worth pondering over for Delhi.
So, Raja, what do we want from NATO? Are we looking obviously at security? Are we looking at what are we looking at? What do we want from them?
Look, I mean, I don't think we look. It is just here is an organization which is a powerful military organization. 30 countries are part of it. I mean, entire Europe is there. So if you want to have, meet all these guys under one roof, you have this is one place where you can engage them. That we see right now, it's that's what we're not talking about membership. I want our viewers to be very clear that they offer consultations on a range of issues, simply military training, missions, just as India does military diplomacy, they're also doing military diplomacy. So that is open. Now the question is, just as we today we talk to the Americans on the Indo-Pacific, we talk to the French on the Indo-Pacific,
Yeah.
we talk to a whole lot of countries, European countries on the Indo-Pacific. So if NATO is really going to step out into the Indo-Pacific as a collective, we say, look, let's sit down and talk about what are the issues at hand. So it can be a political strategic dialogue to start with. And there are cases where, for example, as I said on Afghanistan, where NATO has been sitting there for a long time, we can have more specific discussions of a particular theater. So Delhi is not going to rush into any kind of, military kind of, if you're doing military exercises with the Americans, with the French, with a whole lot of NATO members. So at this point, I think what is practical is to begin a political strategic dialogue with NATO and have an institutional mechanism where we regularly consult with them. Within that, Afghanistan is a very special issue because they've been sitting there for long. I think it's a good time to talk to them about Afghanistan, and they might be taking up other missions. So first, have a mechanism for consultations, political and strategic. Second, have intelligence and other conversations on Afghanistan and Afghanistan's future between our security establishment and NATO, which is served there in a deep way in the last 2 decades.
Yeah. There is this one concern, fear, whatever, that we'll get drawn into all their little, adventures in various parts of the world, willy-nilly, whether you like it or not. Is that a genuine concern? Is it...
Sudha, you're talking as if India is a little baby, Somebody is going to just drag her away and kidnap her into the Gulf. I mean, come on. Look, you are a fifth, today third or fourth largest spender of defense. You are a massive armed force. So this idea, somehow somebody is going to just hijack us. I mean, I just don't understand this mentality because look at NATO members. France has differences with the US. Even other day, France was saying, let's not make it too much of, anti-China stuff. Turkey is a member of NATO. They didn't join American operations in Iraq.
Yeah.
Turkey and Greece, both are members of NATO. They're fighting with each other. So this idea somehow NATO is this, will come and drag you in. You are a little innocent baby walking in this, this is strange. It's only India with a large country has the mindset of a very small country. Somehow you're going to be pushed around. So that's why I said no one is talking. We're talking about the political strategic consultation, just as we do with individual members of NATO. We can do a similar thing with them and talk about other areas at the political level, military level, strategic level. Nobody's talking about operational cooperation.
Yeah.
That is way, way down the road, and I don't think we are anywhere near it.
Mm-hmm. Now, I was talking to a former diplomat, who's dealt with the Americans, the Russians, and all, and he says that when you start getting into things like NATO, it obviously pushes us to work harder with the Russians, because it's not something they're going to like.
No. Why would you be? Russians themselves are talking to them. Why is it Russians will tell us, oh, if you do that, you owe me something?
Russians because they're already unhappy with our association with the Quad.
No, that's already there, So how do you make it worse? Like if they themselves talk to NATO, you are talking to individual members of NATO. You're saying, look, we want to sit with them and talk about Afghanistan. Yeah. So do Russians stop talking to China because you get upset? But I think, this constant fear, our diplomats are pretty excel at that, of finding reasons not to do simple things. That I think been a long tradition, but I would say, look, the Russians do their things with the Chinese, but they also keep us happy. Similarly, you do what you have to do if NATO is open for consultation. You can do the same thing. Russians might talk to Pakistan. They'll have their own relationships. So this, as if somehow, this constant self-doubt, fear that, which is again, I said, look, it's a very special syndrome in Delhi, but I think our government has overcome quite a bit of that. We're doing things with the Americans which we never have done before. So I think the policy is moving, but the fears will, of course, will always be there because we are, so conservative in thinking about and underestimate our own strength.
Yeah. Perhaps it's convenient, it's a convenient excuse to avoid even going in that direction.
No, it's just avoid doing nothing new. That's because we haven't done it. You don't want to do it now. That they're not going to kill you if you just sit there and talk to them. If you talk to them in Afghanistan, how are you going to lose?
Yeah.
If your diplomats sit with NATO diplomats and say, look, okay, let's want to talk about it. Like just as you have a huge number of military consultations with so many countries, where you, at the staff level, you're talking about strategic issues, military developments. That is fairly simple and straightforward. We can do with at any time of we are.
Now, given our bilateral, given our bilateral linkages with France, with the US, all these countries that have at some time or the other, even Germany, that at some time or the other have been involved in Afghanistan, would you say we're already halfway there?
No, we are not there. As a NATO, we are not talking to them. So as a NATO, as an institution, it has its bureaucracy, it has its headquarters in Brussels. It's got a whole structure of its own. I mean, there is a European Secretary General, there is an American commander. It's a huge structure. So it's just all you need is to begin to get contact and say, look, let's talk. Where can we go? What is possible? So it's we have to start there. But Surya, you didn't mention the fact that at the Raisina Dialogue this year, the NATO Secretary General was invited to speak. So he did speak.
Yeah.
So you can say, if you're asking me, has there been any contact? If you think that is at least a government-sponsored dialogue run by Observer Research Foundation. So the NATO Secretary General spoke there. So I think, the government is thinking creative ways of widening your engagement. But you have the commentariat in Delhi, which is always saying, don't do this, get trapped. I mean, you've seen the debate on the nuclear deal. You've seen the debate on so often. I mean, simple things, we make it rather complicated for ourselves.
Yeah. So NATO in Asia, are we looking at building insurance against China?
Look, I think let's see where they want to go. At this point, they're just debating that. Look, right now, their main operational area has been Europe and the peripheries of Europe. So they're a very different world. After the Cold War, they reached out in NATO partnerships with the Russians, who was an adversary before, with China, with Asian countries like Japan. There were a lot of consultations, but there was nothing operational out there. Now, post 91, they also got into what was called out-of-area operations, that is joining Iraq and Afghanistan and these kind of areas where they participated in those exercises. So that has come closer to us. I mean, that is around the periphery of Europe, in the Middle East, greater Middle East, if you will, and Afghanistan is our neighbor as well. So we've seen an expansion of their operations. But now what they're talking about, they just started talking. So it'll be a while before they do saying, NATO needs to focus on China, NATO needs to focus on the Indo-Pacific. So as they turn this idea into action, it's in our interest to talk to them. Even before that, I mean, we don't have to wait till they bring their ships into NATO. We can talk to them about Afghanistan. We can talk to them, look, what are the areas of cooperation that we can have at this point on training, on intelligence sharing, a whole lot of things which we do normally as a normal course with a large number of countries.
Would you say that since there is already a Quad there, we are kind of moving towards, the direction seems fairly clear. I mean,
no, I don't know. Look, I think you're in Delhi. I'm not. I mean, so I don't know what your sources are telling you. But the fact is, look, we've not even, the Raisina Dialogue is the first time we've invited someone to speak. So, and our trustee, I doubt, keeps in touch with them. So first thing is to get in touch and say, look, we're ready to talk on a purely institutional basis. It's not individual countries. NATO is a collective. What are the lessons they've drawn from Afghanistan? What is the plans to support the Afghan government after it gets out? What kind of plans do they have? So these are areas we can, like, just as a delegation from the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defense and your security establishment can simply sit across a table. You're not taking guns and going into, or getting on a ship and trying to fight the Chinese. First, start talking minimal things. So all the things you have in mind, they're way down below. At this point, simply have a conversation.
So last question, Raja. Does dialogue or even the prospect of a partnership with NATO, in that sense, gets us off the hook on Katsa and a whole lot of these other restrictions and embargoes and sanctions?
Look, that's all. Look, how long did it take with the Americans? The first Malabar exercise took place in 92. Now, so that process, it's a process, It is not, you just sit with them across the table and they're going to lift everything. Look, Americans have lifted for their own reasons a lot of things. As I said, look, there are 30 countries sitting there. You get to know a series of Europeans, their military establishments. It's good for our military to know them. And to find ways of engaging them. So what they give you or what you have to give them, we are over that. We're just talking about minimal institutional hello, meet, greet, and say, what do you guys do? What did you do in Afghanistan? What is our interest? We're talking about it at that level.
So last question. One on this allergy, about NATO, US, we seem to be okay with the more authoritarian guys, but there's certain backtracking when it comes to democracies.
Yeah, I mean, that was a past record, but I think we have overcome quite a bit of that. So like you remember the debate on the nuclear deal. You remember the debate on just signing a simple thing like logistics agreement with the Americans.
Yeah, it took years.
15 years. And then with the French, we signed it in 1 year. And then we signed ready-made with anybody who's now we signed Lemova without any blinking an eyelid. So so I think we've passed that. I don't know, you have think tanks and all might still be conservative. But the government policy has moved on. In the NATO, they haven't moved yet, but in a whole lot of areas. So when the Prime Minister said, look, India's historic visitations with the Americans were over, that was quite some time. On the G7 meeting, he said, look, India is a natural ally of the G7 in fighting authoritarianism, terrorism, extremism. So we already identified a set of goals. So I think, look, it's such a simple thing to deal with NATO at a very minimal level. Unless you have information or something is going on or there is a new debate. But my sense, look, it's easily done. I think the government has moved on quite a bit. But it is really the public debate which is still somehow this kind of deep ambivalence, as if NATO is the kind of is going to entrap you into their structures. Look, as I said, look, NATO members have fought with each other. Greece and Turkey continue to fight in the Eastern Mediterranean. That Turkey did not participate in a number of actions. There was a time when France walked out of something and came. Even the other day, some NATO countries are saying, no, let's not make China our enemy. So there are multiple differences. So I don't see what is the problem in simply sitting down and talking to them. As I said, you're not going with your guns. You're not going with you're sending your diplomats. To sit down with the NATO headquarters and say, look, what is it we can do? Tell us about Afghanistan. Tell us about what are your plans for Asia. We would like to know. If you're going to come here, where is your debate?
And you would say NATO is now ready for an Asia orientation.
That was the declaration that was issued at the NATO summit. But for the first time, both the G7, the NATO in the past never mentioned China. They said Russia was the threat. But this time they said, well, Russia remains the principal challenge because that's next door. China is the challenge. So that's saying it for the first time. So they will take time. It's not going to happen tomorrow. Then the ships are not going to show up in the South China Sea. But it's the moment to talk to them. You see, I don't see why we should be afraid of talking to anybody in the world who wants to talk to us.
Yeah, absolutely. On that note, Raja Mohan, thank you very much for your insight. And looking forward to more such conversations ahead.
Thank you, Siri.
And to all of you out there, this is all we have on The Gist today. Follow us on social media, Instagram and Twitter, and keep sending us your comments and your observations. Thank you all very much.